My name is Simona Brinkmann and I am an artist originally from Italy, but I've lived in Britain most of my life. I have an art practice which is mainly London-based, but I've kind of shown in different places and done residencies and so on in different places. A lot of the materials that I use have a kind of quality which is to do with how easy they are to fetishize, or how much they lend themselves to that process, and that's something I'm deliberately interested in. That whole kind of process of fetishizing something. First of all, because when you fetishize something, you kind of take it and you add new meanings to it that were not necessarily there to start with. As an artist, I find that really interesting because it's to do with how meaning is constructed and how various meanings overlay one on top of each other and become like an accrued sort of thing or a cumulative sort of thing. So that's a really interesting process. And also very often the things that I choose are, say, for example, objects from the real world that have a reference to the real world. And they may be objects that either I decide to remake in a way that is almost identical, very, very similar to how that thing occurs in real life, but with a kind of slippage that perhaps, just alters it or modifies it or derails it a little bit. Or there might be objects that I just take as they are, but I represent them in a kind of different way. So there's this idea that things are kind of both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Very often when I make work, I think about work in terms of shows, not so much individual pieces. So definitely my practice is a lot about drawing relationships between things. It's quite an intensive process, kind of having a certain set of ideas and then dealing with the materials hands-on to try and draw those ideas out. And so a residency is really a perfect environment to do that because you just get away from the kind of everyday stresses and you can just have a kind of really sustained period of intense working, which is so valuable. I think the residency has been this kind of whoosh, and I'm still in the kind of immediate aftermath of the whoosh. It's kind of like this cloud of vapor that I'm still in, and I think only when the vapor clears, I'll be able to kind of, the richness of the experience in all its aspects will make itself more evident. But the setup for working has been absolutely perfect. So I had a little studio and I was able to work in the gallery to kind of use it as a project space, and people have just been wonderful. So it's been really, it just felt like a really supported sort of experience, both in terms of the funding and the time, but also like just people's attitude in terms of, it felt like a very enabling sort of experience. So yeah, great. The show is called Override. I think it makes sense to use the word somehow because the show is very much about a kind of supplanting of certain meanings by other meanings, a kind of superseding, overriding of certain ways of interpreting objects. Or the way that objects present themselves. And it kind of also implies a hierarchy of meanings, possibly. So it kind of seemed to make sense. I wanted to complicate the way that people would experience the space. So it's a beautiful space, but it's a really big, wide open space. And I really wanted people to have a feeling of having to kind of negotiate their way around it and to be able to kind of journey through it. There isn't a prescribed route through the work, but there's a big obstacle right at the front of it that you have to kind of get round before you get to see everything else. And there are works placed in corners to highlight certain overlooked corners. So I wanted to also sort of play with all of that and kind of articulate the space in that way.